Jujutsu Kaisen is now ending, and I want to take a look at Gojo's entire story and everything that happens to him, because you'll have seen the countless memes on it, but have you ever stopped to really think about that famous line, are you Gojo Satoru because you're the strongest, or are you the strongest because you're Gojo Satoru? Is there something that you listening to this would feel as though you're no longer you if it was taken away? In this video, I'm going to look at that question and many other little reflections Gojo caused me to have, as well as his character and the events of the story as a whole, from lots of different angles. Obviously, it's a long video, most of it is anime only content, and a spoiler warning will be given before we go into any manga content, so there's no need to worry about spoilers. Also, we'll be going in chronological order because that just made far more sense for me in terms of looking at his character development and why he is the way he is. There's also just far more to say in a hidden inventory arc than anything else, so we can get into the good stuff right away. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video. So, starting from his time as a second year student, back when he had what he still considers to be his best and perhaps only friend, Suguru Geto. Of course, he would very soon gain the title of the strongest, and whilst he doesn't notice at the time, these interactions he has with Geto are ones he would look back on as perhaps the only time in his life that someone saw him as Gojo, and not simply the strongest sorcerer. A time where he was treated as a normal human instead of the pillar of society, where he'd get into arguments with his friends and pass the time playing basketball. A time where he didn't have these impossible burdens and decisions with countless lives on the line. And we see how utterly carefree he is through his conversations with Geto, where he talks about seeing protecting the weak as a pain and how he hates Geto's constant thinking and analysing over the right thing to do. So perhaps he's a little too carefree, but at this point in time, he doesn't have or feel the responsibility to protect people the same way Geto does, and of course, Gojo later would. He's then given the mission to escort and allow the Star Plasma Vessel to merge with Tengen, in order to halt his evolution, as he may otherwise end up losing his will, causing all the barriers he creates that keeps Jujutsu Society operating smoothly. Him shutting down would be bad enough, but if he ends up becoming an enemy instead, it would be a global disaster. Ironically, all of that could apply to Gojo too. But anyway, with the stakes at hand, it's not really brought up at all that this girl who's done nothing wrong, who currently lives a completely normal, innocent life, is gonna have to be sacrificed just because she was born to fill this role. Something which Gojo later seems to accept is that, as awful as it sounds, some lives are worth more in Jujutsu Society. If someone like Gojo or Tengen sees this to be, an uncountable number of other lives would be lost. So, with the plasma vessel now being essential for Tengen's continued existence, she's now on that list of more essential lives, which gives her a similarity with Gojo. However, the major difference is, of course, one is bordering on godlike strength and the other is a defenseless teenager, obviously completely unable to do anything about her upcoming fate. There is of course a case to be made that Gojo's strength is actually what locks him into his fate, with his two choices being to either be this human weapon, shoulder this impossible burden, or to leave it to someone else, in which case who knows how many people will die, but we'll come back to that later. Anyway, with a word to Geto about how they'll be fine because we're the strongest, emphasis on we, something we'll come back to again, but the mission begins, and I'm not going to go through everything here, but the grunts sent to stop them are utterly powerless against Gojo. Even Q's strongest soldier has his title promptly taken away from him by the true strongest. They rescue Amani, and she's clearly trying to make peace with her fate, saying it's not actually the end because Tengen is her and she is Tengen, so she will live on. And Gojo just isn't interested. He just doesn't really care about anything that she's saying, despite the fact that it's pretty awful what's about to happen to her. That's how it seems on the surface, anyway, and we'll come back to that side of Gojo. Tengen orders the group to follow Riko's requests, which, correct me if I'm missing something here, but it looks like it's done out of almost kindness from him. I don't see any other reason why he would have told him to do that, when, as Gojo says, it would be safer to take her back to the school. Geto ends up being the one to point out how cold, albeit for quite logical reasons, Gojo is being right now, as this is the last time she'll be able to see her friends or experience anything at all. He seems to realize that we don't know what it's like to merge with Tengen. It might be a peaceful end, or it could be a sort of eternal nightmare of being partly conscious or trapped somewhere or anything. But Gojo doesn't seem to care. In the fight that follows, he takes great enjoyment in explaining his abilities and how strong he is, and it's clearly nothing to do with the whole revealing your technique strengthens it, as he was already effortlessly winning. But whilst he'd happily talk for ages about his technique, he probably says more in this one fight than he does to her in this entire arc up to this point. Of course, this will soon change, beginning a really beautiful bit of character development for him. We see the first glimpses of this here, where following Kuroi's kidnapping, he could have simply decided to ignore Marnie's requests and take her straight to Tengen. Instead, he acknowledges her need to say goodbye and agrees on a compromise. Once they arrive, he goes against the logical idea of simply hiding her away, and instead allows her to do some sightseeing, which on first read through looks as though he's had a very sudden change of heart over the plane journey. But it's later revealed in a flashback that Gojo and Geto had already agreed that if she didn't want to go through with the merger, they'd stand by her side, even if it meant taking on Tengen. The two strongest had agreed to use their powers to allow Amani to have the future she wants. This whole time they're on the beach, Gojo keeps his technique on and stays awake to ensure everyone's safety, despite the obvious exhaustion this is causing him. And I think this is who Gojo is and would be, even if he wasn't the strongest. Of course, the two aren't unrelated. It's that isolation of being the strongest that's kind of pushed him down this path of wanting to save people who are in a similar situation to he was growing up, or rather, that he's been in his whole life since he was born. He's not as cold as he seems on the surface. Even in his younger years where he seems very uncaring at first, I think he just honestly has trouble communicating, which again probably isn't too surprising given the life of isolation he's lived. However, as he soon finds out, not living selfishly and instead trying to take care of others will put you in some very difficult situations in the Jujutsu world. It's worth it, of course, as we'll come back to, but in his exhausted state, the moment he drops his technique, Toji slips in behind with his sword, beginning the fight that will change Gojo forever. The irony of the strongest sorcerer being pressured so hard by a man with no curse energy whatsoever is definitely not lost on Gojo here. The battle of Infinity versus Zero begins with some of the flashiest, coolest looking attack in the series, struggling to deal with what is essentially just a very fast, strong guy. Gojo breaks everything around him to leave himself isolated on a small platform in the center. Of course, very symbolic of how he'll be following this fight. Even Gojo's 6 eyes, considered an almost divine blessing, has trouble dealing with the huge swarm of simple flyheads Toji surrounds him with. It's as though everything Gojo thought he knew about himself, his technique, his strength, is not just being challenged, but it's crumbling right in front of him. His declaration of "we'll be fine, we're the strongest" is being very directly challenged. His usual techniques that effortlessly blew away those assassins earlier aren't working at all. He's found an opponent that he simply doesn't know how to deal with. And above all, despite all his claims about not caring about protecting the weak, he finds himself turning to rush to protect Amani. The opening is not missed by Toji, who, I don't know if I can even show this bit without getting demonetized, but it's brutal, right? And obviously it's super shocking at the time because the idea of Gojo actually losing is completely alien to us at this point. It's slightly offset by the fact that we know he has to survive somehow, but even with that in mind, just the fact that he was able to be brought to this state completely breaks this aura of invincibility he had. They do rebuild it somewhat, following all of this with the way he upgrades his technique, so we kind of think, oh, he's now even stronger than he was there. Maybe he's invincible again now, but it's just not quite what it was. And this is very clearly intentionally done, given the first season's recurring theme of when Gojo shows up, the day is saved. As I think there's only so many times they could do that before it starts to feel a little repetitive, and I think Gege timed this perfectly before that started to happen at all. It allowed for much higher stakes in the arc following this, in the Shibuya Incident, as that kind of guarantee that Gojo would win felt like it had gone. And obviously with that arc directly following this, when we're watching the Shibuya Incident, it feels like we just got shown this defeat of Gojo's for a reason. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Geto reveals to Amanai about what he'd discussed with Gojo earlier, that she only has to go through with the merger if she wants to, except Toji, the man who's commented to have escaped the curse of the Zenin family, to have effectively defied fate to enforce Amani's fate on her. And I'm not going to go through the whole fight, but Toji is able to defeat Geto. And I'll go into this in more detail if and when I make a video on Geto, but it's interesting that Toji not only uses the word monkey, which Geto would later use, but also when Geto claimed he was the only person who knew the taste of a curse, Toji actually knows that taste too, as he swallows the cursed spirit he keeps on him. Anyway, Toji walks out the building with his mission complete, only to be greeted with a man risen from the dead, Gojo Satoru, who's rambling on, and he looks high to Toji as he talks about how on death's door he was able to understand the core of cursed energy and is now able to use reverse curse technique to heal himself. Toji reflects on Gojo's move pool and decides that he can indeed take him down, despite this slight feeling of unease he has. Meanwhile, Gojo admits to himself that in that moment, he's not thinking about her. He's not angry at her sake for being killed, and he seems like he feels guilty about her. You know, after all, he was shown to have some compassion for her, but right now all he can think about is how amazing it feels that throughout heaven and earth, I alone am the honored one. And some people see this as him being very selfish and self-centered, which is fair enough. I'm not denying that he sometimes can be, but I really don't think it's fair to look at a singular scene and decide that that's all he is. You know, it's something I'll come back to later in chapter 236, but for now I just want to say that we could all have, you know, thoughts we wouldn't want the world to know about. You know, a part of ourselves that we're not particularly proud of. But the way he acts throughout the series shows to me that Gojo was anything but selfish. Again, I'll come back to this later, but I think we're far more than just our lowest moments, you know, our darkest thoughts and the parts of ourselves we don't like. You know, that doesn't mean we can just excuse any actions we take, but Gojo hasn't actually done anything morally wrong here. He's just being more self-centered than he maybe wishes he was. Also, he did just almost die and lose a lot of blood, and for the first time in his life, faced an opponent that effectively beat him. It's perhaps not too surprising that his brain wasn't thinking about much outside of this fight. Ironically, we'll soon see how that becomes exactly his downfall in the Shibuya Incident, but regardless, there's a very fair point to be made here, in that perhaps the bliss he's experiencing has nothing to do with feeling lightheaded from blood loss, but instead he feels as though he's regained his status as the strongest, the thing that makes him who he is, after essentially just losing it moments earlier. It's such a core part of who he is that losing it would surely be a pretty traumatic thing to go through, right? But I actually think the complete opposite is more likely the case. But again, that's for later on in this video. Returning to the fight, Gojo fires off his strongest technique, Hollow Purple, at Toji, defeating him before noting his last words about his child being sold to the Zenin clan. And at the end of this chapter, there's a note from the narrator about how what broke then was the heart, which with Toji already being dead, more than likely refers to Gojo, especially given the state we see him in afterwards. The way Toji simply tells Gojo to do whatever he wants with the child, which obviously includes killing him right? I'm sure that's something Toji would have considered to be a possibility, that Gojo would simply decide to prematurely kill what could grow up to be a threat to him in the same way Toji was. Because obviously he doesn't know that Megumi is very different to Toji. Thankfully, Gojo isn't like that at all, and instead actually encourages Megumi to become strong enough to keep up with him. Of course, Toji's hope was that knowing the conflict between the Gojo and Zenin clans, Gojo would stop Megumi from being sold there, a guess which turns out to be correct, albeit for slightly different reasons, and shows some faith from Toji in Gojo to help out his son. Although it would probably be more accurate to say that rather than faith in Gojo, he just saw it as a last resort, a desperate attempt to save his son. And something about this line, along with the events of the last few days, seems to have really just broken his heart. And he is a very different man from here on out, especially in this next scene. So we get this seriously creepy shot of Gojo holding Imani's dead body, surrounded by this applause, which always makes me shudder a bit. But anyway, Geto's in a shock to see Gojo, which means he went there without stopping to let Geto know he was alive, or to even check if Geto was alive, which says a lot about his mental state here. He clearly was not thinking straight whatsoever. It's as though he's crashed after his earlier high. And he then asks Geto if they should simply kill them all, which really shows just how shaken they both are by this incident. Geto more so, but Gojo as well. Obviously that kind of swaps around and ends up being the other way around in the aftermath of this. But for this moment here and now, Gojo is the one struggling far more, and Geto is the one to kind of bring him back to a more normal state as such. But regardless, this is a whole new era for the pair of them, and this following episode is one of my favorite in the series. Firstly, we see a much more stable looking Gojo practicing being able to use his techniques automatically rather than just manually, and using reverse technique to enable him to use it permanently. Gojo's loneliness isn't something we've spoken about so far, because at this point in time, he wasn't lonely at all. But the clear symbolism here of only those objects or people he manually chooses to allow in will start to make itself far more real from this point onwards. In Geto's words, Gojo was now the strongest. The we the pair previously had now completely gone as Gojo begins to reach his potential. Geto's declining mental state is something that I'll go more into in a separate video on him, but at this point in time, it looks as though the only change to Gojo was him updating his technique to ensure he doesn't lose in that way again. Whereas Geto is mentioned to have lost weight, become more distant, have bags under his eyes. You know, he's clearly not sleeping, he's not functioning as a human. And I think Gojo simply doesn't dwell as much on this kind of thing. You know, he's able to move past it much faster, and he's also evidently focusing on his strength and his missions, whereas Geto doesn't seem to have as much to distract himself with. It sounds like Gojo's going on most of the missions, and Geto's just kind of left alone with his thoughts. Regardless, Geto was there to stop Gojo from snapping at his lowest point, but Gojo seemingly wasn't there for Geto at his. So Geto wants to free the world of curses, and he ends up snapping, burning down the whole village, deciding to kill all non-sorcerers to rid the world of curses. And again, separate video for this, but it's wild how much more healthy and sane he looks once he does so. You know, this is the happiest we've ever seen him. And unsurprisingly, this comes as a complete shock to Gojo. I'm sure he noticed something was up with Geto, but I don't think he realized at all the depths of how bad he'd gotten. Whether this was due to him being away more on missions or just more focused on his technique is unclear. It's probably both, but regardless, whilst his 6 eyes help with seeing cursed energy, they evidently do nothing when it comes to seeing the state of those around him. Something that comes up repeatedly throughout the series is that even for the strongest in the world, saving others in any sense of the word is quite often beyond him. The world of Jujutsu society is simply that cold and cruel. He confronts Geto on it, and interestingly, his first objection to this was, you can't do it, not that you shouldn't do it. Now, I might be very wrong here, but I don't think this is out of arrogance as Geto claims. It's possible that that's just naturally the first objection his brain came up with, as a man presently obsessed with strength and strength alone, rather than any sort of moral conundrums. He's stressed out of his mind, and that was just his immediate reaction where he's not thinking straight. But I think what's more likely is that the argument he's making here is all of this won't achieve anything. You'll just kill a bunch of people and we'll still have curses because you're not going to be able to take out them all. But as Geto says, Gojo could do it, giving us that iconic line, are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? So here's the thing, Gojo can do whatever he wants, no one can stop him, right? And so everything he does because he wants to, not because he has to or needs to. The only thing binding him to saving people and exercising curses is that he feels as though he has a responsibility to. Seeing as so many strong curses started popping up in response to his birth. If he decides he doesn't care anymore, or that he no longer sees a moral responsibility to, he simply won't. No one could force him to. And yeah, to an extent this applies to everyone, but they're all limited by what they could choose to do instead. If nothing else, by money, right? For instance, when Nanami wanted to stop being a sorcerer, he had to get an office job to continue to pay the bills. So hopefully you get the point I'm making here, in that everyone else has to follow the rules and such to some extent. But Gojo is different. There's nothing he couldn't decide to do instead, which is why I think a certain criticism sent his way later on that he's selfish and doesn't care about the next generation simply isn't true. If he didn't want to be a teacher, he wouldn't be. He could, at any moment, decide to live like Sukuna, simply going after whatever he feels like in the moment, delving into hedonism, and no one could stop him. Almost every decision he makes is completely unbound from the question, can I do it? Me and you can't say the same, right? Just as a mundane example, we probably both want to tell our bosses to do one every now and then, but we can't, right? Because we've got bills to pay. Sure, we could quit and get a new job, yeah, but you get the point I'm making here. We have to think about whether or not we're actually able to do something first. Geto obviously has a far more extreme example, and I'm sure a big thing he was weighing up in his head before making this decision was, can I actually do this? But as he says, if he was Satoru Gojo, he'd be able to. And I think as well as a tinge of jealousy at Gojo's strength, I think he's also wondering, if I had that much power, the right thing to do would make itself clear to me, as I wouldn't have to worry about whether or not I could do it, I would just do the right thing. Or, just to be clear, what Geto believes to be the right thing to do. I don't agree with what he's trying to do for obvious reasons here. Anyway, when Geto asks, are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo? He's essentially asking, is the title of the strongest obtainable by anyone else or just you? Were you born into this role? Which was, yeah, Gojo had to train and improve his technique. It's still probably fair to say that even with a regular level of training, there was no one in this era that could ever hope to match the combined powers of the Limitless and the Six Eyes. Anyway, the point being that Gojo has essentially been given a role, been given a purpose, whilst Geto sees everything he does as pointless. He can't exercise curses any faster than they're being born or created or manifested, I suppose is probably the best word. It's like Gojo's infinity. Even if it looks like he's getting closer, he's never going to reach anything. And so the whole reason he snaps is to try and break that cycle. But from Gojo's point of view, he doesn't understand what Geto's saying. None of this makes sense to him. He's just effectively being hit in the face with how wide the gulf between him and his friend has become. He doesn't understand what Geto's saying or why he's doing what he is. He's just stunned by what has happened to my friend. And looking back, this is undoubtedly the moment Gojo started to become just the strongest. Are you Gojo Satoru because you're the strongest? It's almost quite a cruel question from Geto, as though he's saying, you're nothing without. And this is something that obviously really bugs Gojo throughout the rest of his life. But as I said, I don't think it's true at all, But it is a very important reminder that we shouldn't be these one-dimensional beings. It's fine to have one thing you really focus on or obsess over, but you should have something outside of that too, because otherwise it can result in some really unhealthy thought patterns and behaviors. And I found in my experience that it really affects the thing I'm focusing on too, especially when the inevitable threat of it being taken away makes itself known, which can happen even to Gojo, right? But anyway, I spoke about this more in these videos here that I'll link below. Obviously 2 totally different series, but check them out if you're interested in what I was just talking about. But anyway, Gojo does have something else, and we see a prime example of this at the end of this arc, where he goes to see Megami to prevent him from being sold to the Zenin clan. But despite the way Gojo clearly sees himself quite lowly, given the way he says Megami's dad was a scumbag, even by my standards, he's not there to force him to do anything. Instead he gives him the freedom to choose what he wants to do. He just, informs him of what the less preferable option would be. But going back to what I was saying earlier, it's interesting that he waited a year after Toji told him about Megami to actually go and see him, especially as Toji said 2 or 3 years until it'd be sold. Evidently, what's happened with Geto has really got him thinking about his role in the Jujutsu world, and maybe he's had this mini existential crisis where he decides he wants to do something beyond just being the strongest. And something I really respect him for is that he wastes no time in doing so. He just sees a bit of good he can do and does so. Anyway, that concludes the hidden inventory arc, which among other things I think was a very necessary and well executed look into the more kind of human side of Gojo. We're able to connect with him a lot more now. He was far from just one-dimensional in the first season, but he's definitely now a lot more humanized than he previously was. And with that, we'll move forward in chronological order to his first appearance as an adult in JJK 0. I'm only going to spend a few minutes on JJK 0, and I'm not going to spend too much time on the dynamic between him and Yuta, because it's quite similar to that of him and Yuji. So obviously starting very explicitly with the way he prevented both their executions, with his firm belief of no one's allowed to take the youth away from young people. In Yuta's case, he actually originally consented to be executed before Gojo stepped in. Not only that, Rika stopped Yuta from doing it himself. So given that he doesn't seem to be in that kind of headspace at all following the event, it's perhaps one of Gojo's most successful or complete saves, for lack of a better phrase. I'll explain that in a few minutes once we get to Yuji, who he only kind of partly or mostly saves in my opinion. Anyway, in terms of saving the youth, he's forced to acknowledge that the person who's the biggest threat to them is arguably Suguru Geto, who's killed hundreds or thousands by this point, and is now directly turning his sights towards Jujutsu High, obviously filled with the exact young people Gojo wishes to protect. Obviously he has this fight against Miguel, but I don't think there's actually too much to say about Gojo in this film that I haven't already said or will say, in terms of his character development. We see the way he throws aside decades of hard work from another nation in a second, which I thought was a great way to put into perspective just how strong he is now. But I think everything else that I could say about him in this film, I'm going to do so with Yuji in a bit. Except that's only true up until the end of the movie. There's obviously quite a lot to say about when he returns to Jujutsu High to find Geto on death's door. And unlike Gojo, he doesn't have the ability to return from it, with his final words being that in spite of his bottomless hatred for Jujutsu society, he never had an ounce of hate for those in Jujutsu High. He just felt that he couldn't laugh from his heart in the cruel world he wanted to change. So the really interesting part is we don't see Gojo's last words to Geto. And obviously, there's only 2 things it could really be. And whilst I hate when people force romances out of nothing in a series, I do think the fact that it was off screen does actually make it possible that this was some sort of romantic confession. You know, obviously nothing is confirmed, but it just seems odd that if he was calling Geto just a friend or saying, I forgive you or anything like that, why would it be off-screen the way it was? And of course, there's a huge theme of love throughout this film, so again, definitely not confirmed, but it's certainly possible. And that possibility only makes the scene even more tragic for Gojo. Either way, Geto does not return whatever Gojo says, and instead says that he should have cursed him at the end. In spite of that, he still says to Yuta that Geto was at least his best friend, the only one he had. And this begins Gojo's time of loneliness. You know, there's no one else who looks at him without seeing his strength first. And quite cruelly, he's already had to acknowledge that even his strength isn't always enough. He can only save those who want to be saved. Something that I think Yuji very quickly realized a few chapters ago in the manga, but I won't go into that in this video. Speaking of Yuji, we're now finally at episode 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen, around a year and a half on from the events of JJK 0, which is crazy because it feels like so much more, right? And it's actually been a decade since the events of the Hidden Inventory arc, so Gojo feels notably more mature and has postponed Yuji's execution until all the fingers of Sukuna have been found. Of course, as is later revealed, he hides one of the fingers himself to indefinitely postpone the execution. Gojo is doing this for his cause of preventing the youth from being taken away from young people. But once again, just because he's the strongest doesn't make him limitless. Hang on, no pun intended there. Anyway, there's only so much freedom he can give back to Yuji. He can prevent his execution, yeah, but he can't get Sukuna out of him. He was able to help Yuta with his curse, but he can't do that for Yuji. And whereas Yuta came out of what seemed to be a miserable school existence, Yuji has instead been thrown into his role as Sukuna's vessel, one which will completely take away the carefree youth Yuji was enjoying at his school, you know, breaking world records and laughing with his friends. You know, instead he's now forced to live in the incredibly cruel world of Jujutsu sorcery. Don't get me wrong, like he makes new friends, etc. But he has to go through some utterly horrific events, and there's nothing Gojo can do about it. It's not like you can just say to Yuji, yeah, I know you have someone called the King of Curses in you who could take over at any moment, but you know, don't worry about that, you know? And none of this is to criticize Gojo, obviously, right? It's obviously not his fault, and it's very telling of how capable he is when it's actually noteworthy that there's something that he can't do. The point I'm making is that I'm sure Gojo was very conscious of this, because Yuji is now in a way in an opposite situation to Gojo. If Gojo dies, the uprising of curses in his absence would take the lives of countless others. But Yuji staying alive has potential to do the same if Sukuna is able to return to his full strength through him. However, they do also have the potential to end Sukuna once and for all through Yuji, so it's decided to let him live until they can do so. Of course, before any of that happens, Gojo tells Yuji to let Sukuna take over so he can show off against him. And don't get me wrong with the way he jokes about his food, etc. Clearly a big part of this is him wanting to show off, as well as, you know, the excitement of having the only person who could hope to match his strength right in front of him. But I do also think part of him just wanted to reassure Yuji that, you know, if it comes to it, yeah, I can beat Sukuna, so don't worry. But moving ahead, just like Megami, he never forces his decision on him. Obviously, there isn't much of a decision to be made, right? If someone says to you, well, do you want to die now or do you want to die later? It's pretty obvious which one you're gonna pick, right? But Gojo's smart enough to realize that what can seem obvious isn't necessarily the case, as we'll see much later on in this video. Anyway, Gojo shows up fairly sporadically in the first season, and no more is the Gojo who kind of scoffs at the idea of righteousness. Later on we see him forcing Jichi to ask him why he became a teacher, and he says he wants to reset the rotten world caused by the higher-ups. But of course, it's not as simple as killing them, because they'd only be replaced by people equally as bad. It's kind of interesting that the idea of him running everything never seems to enter his head, despite Sukuna kind of hinting at this with his surprise at Gojo not being the boss and saying that any hierarchy besides strength is boring. And I can only assume that this is either because he doesn't think he'd be able to, or that he'd be too busy on missions to be able to do so, or it's because he doesn't see that as a long-term solution. That will last for as long as Gojo lives, but what about after that? He needs to find a way to change the world itself, not just the higher-ups. Which I think is likely the case, as he talks about how he's raising strong allies who will be as good as him one day. Again, having a very different view to when he saw himself as the singular honored one. And I think this is due to the whole being the strongest doesn't mean he could do everything that we've spoken about. None of this means that he's completely separated himself from his identity as the strongest, nor that he stopped enjoying his love of showing off, as in the fight against Jogo in the following episode, he once again takes a great deal of joy in explaining his technique to Jogo, and even brings Yuji along to watch him use his domain, which just looks so damn cool. And again, I'm not going to go through every tiny little appearance that Gojo makes in the season, but I think the incident at Jujutsu High does such a great job of giving him this feeling of the strongest, which is probably the best executed case of that archetype I've seen in the series, along with maybe All Might. The way that every event has to revolve around him, and every character acts and responds to his position as the strongest so differently, really brings that feeling to life. You can really feel his presence and the way the world distorts around him every time he shows up. And somehow, rather than getting repetitive, it only seems to get more exciting each time. There are of course plenty of other characters in other shows that are probably actually stronger in their respective worlds than Gojo is in his, but none feel like the strongest in their verse in the same way he does, except maybe Yujiro from Baki. But I think the most unique thing about the way Gojo is written is that he's written the way a villain would be written. Normally it's the impossibly strong villain that everyone needs to figure out how to be. In Jujutsu Kaisen they flip it around. It's the villains trying to figure out how to take this monster down. Also, I feel like Gojo could be put on the curse's side, have absolutely nothing changed with regards to the rest of his character, and he would feel like a brilliant villain, right? He's quite sadistic, he's got that just the right amount of arrogance, and he's completely, utterly fit. You put him on the villain's side and he fits in there perfectly. I'm sure there's plenty of examples of this in other series, but something about Gojo just works, and it's quite hard to define exactly why. He's just so likable despite having a lot of traits we ordinarily wouldn't like. And I think it's just purely because we naturally take the side of the humans over the curses. So Gojo is on our side, which makes us like him. Although obviously there's plenty of other parts of his personality that are just really likable as well. And the other quite unique side of his writing is, unlike just about every other shonen out there, there's no power, friendship and bonds in here. In fact, they're Gojo's weaknesses, and they're quite ruthlessly used against him next season. As after all, Gojo is at his strongest when he's alone. Anyone else just gets in his way, which links him very nicely to the very end of the season, where he has this conversation with Megumi about the value of selfishness in Jujutsu society. Because no matter how many strong allies you have, when you die, you'll die alone. So this idea, and obviously Yuji's grandpa's words to him, are something I'll cover in a video on Yuji. But I do actually think what Gojo's saying is contradicted pretty often in what we've seen in the anime. For pretty much all the deaths bar Mekamaru, who obviously couldn't ever be with the others, the one dying is very much not alone. For the first two in particular, they actually die shortly after it's proven to them that they're not alone. With Geto and Yuji reassuring Amani and Jinpei respectively. And obviously, Gojo was there at the end of Geto's life, but evidently he felt like Geto was still alone, that he wasn't properly there for him. Of course, it's not as simple as that, but regardless, I think the idea that everyone in the Jujutsu world dies alone simply isn't true. Anyway, I know the whole point of the speech to Megumi was to tell him to stop seeing his life as something he could or even should throw away if need be, but it's still an interesting point. And with that, we conclude Gojo's time in season 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen. Obviously, we went through the hidden inventory arc at the start of this video, but in the series it's right before Shibuya. And one thing that it made clear is that for all his immense strength, Gojo is not invincible. He's pretty close, right? But there's this seed planted in our head that it is entirely possible for him to lose, given enough planning. And so, moving ahead to the Shibuya Incident, a veil is lifted over the area around the station, and civilians at the edge are yelling, "Bring Gojo Satoru." As they panic among themselves after realizing they can't get out and they can't get reception, Gojo enters the veil. And the fact there's such a complicated system of barriers, along with the civilian shouting his name, can only mean one thing, that this is all happening because of Gojo's strength. This incident here is caused by his existence, and his strength is effectively the reason these civilians are going to die, because the elaborate plan to surround him with civilians, which would then be killed, was the only way the curses could see to actually beat him. Right, if there was against someone like Yuta, who's strong but not impossibly so, they would have either ambushed him or maybe taken a few hostages. But a trap on this scale, like a massacre on this level, was necessary for Gojo Satoru. And they take away virtually every weapon he has, as using them would add to the casualties, but even that and 2 special grade curses is completely meaningless against him. The curse that both Yuji and Todo struggled so much against is just brushed aside by Gojo with pretty much just his bare hands. But in spite of that, it's pretty clear the pair do believe that they can beat Gojo, and that belief alone is effectively a chip in his identity as the strongest. And we see his absolute disgust when he realizes that the curses do genuinely think they can beat him with their trap. Right, the fact that these two have faced him once before and still believe it possible to beat him shows to us in the audience that something is definitely up here. Despite how it looks, the thought of Gojo losing just grows and grows as we go on. But one thing that this entire plan hinges on is Gojo wanting to save the civilians, right? It would be extremely easy for him to just open his domain and beat the curses, but that would crush a lot of the civilians at the same time. However, they also have to be careful not to kill too many civilians to the point where there's too few lives for it to actually be worthwhile risking his own, and instead he'd be better off just killing everything in the area. That kind of decision is utterly incomprehensible to everyone else on the planet, right? At what point is there too few people for it to matter? And I can't imagine the mental burden of having to repeatedly make decisions like this with no one to look to for advice or reassurance, no one to tell you when you've made the right call, but we don't see any of that on the surface of Gojo. No one in the verse does. We get to hear it occasionally when we're shown his thoughts, but no one else does. Instead, they see this almost unhinged, slightly sadistic excitement at hurting the curses who dared to think they could beat him. His pride as the strongest is on full display, and that's something a lot of people both inside and outside the series criticize him for, is his arrogance and selfishness here, that he doesn't care about saving people and instead only enjoys the rush of it. But I think both can be true. He can enjoy the rush of being the strongest and still want to save people. The two aren't as contradictory as they seem. Anyway, he kills Hanami and then chases after Jogo in a way not too unsimilar to Yuji and Mahito at the end of this arc. And as he accepts that he won't be able to save everyone, the curses realize he's still far too composed for their plan to work, and send trains full of transfigured humans his way. Jogo thinks to himself that if Gojo was willing to sacrifice everyone on the 5th floor, he could save everyone outside of it, right? And in hindsight, this might have actually resulted in fewer casualties overall, but being a curse, he doesn't realize that it's really not that simple of a decision. Obviously Gojo is going to look for any way possible to avoid doing that, for a way to save everyone he possibly can. Although the point about the sacrifices you're willing to make are people killed by curses, not people killed by you, is probably true. It probably is far easier to stomach that and to focus on avoiding the latter and preventing the former rather than trying to find some combination of two that reduce the overall casualties. Because you can imagine how much that would weigh on him. And it's simply not a line he wants to cross, right? For obvious reasons, And so he gambles on a domain lasting 0.2 seconds. And the thing is, the narrator describes it as on instinct and Gojo believed, meaning he didn't know if that was the right amount. He had no idea if he'd killed all these civilians or not, which means he was left to think about that during his time in the prison realm. But we'll come back to that. He goes into a frenzy taking out 1,000 transfigured humans in 299 seconds, which is over 3 people a second for 5 minutes straight. Transfigured or not, that's definitely enough to rattle someone. And so he stands for the first time in the series, I'm pretty sure, panting, out of breath, surrounded by a massacre, no doubt wondering to himself what's next, and the prison realm opens. It's a very quick, brief moment in the anime, but we see the shot of Gojo looking at his reflection and not seeing his face. His identity as the strongest has kind of broken a little bit. As harsh as it is to say, from the outside looking in, you could see this as a pretty big failure from Gojo. He took out just one of the multiple special grade curses around him. He managed to limit the casualties somewhat, but they're already incredibly high and are only going to grow now that he's about to be sealed. So obviously I'm not blaming him, but the point is that I'm sure this was going through his head. And it seems like that Gojo has felt for a long time now that his strength is the only thing he really has, and there's even that little bit where they ask everyone who knows them, who is Gojo to you? And all they say is, he's done this for me, and of course, he's the strongest. And so I think the point of this panel from Gege here is that Gojo just feels empty right now. I think he knew as soon as he saw the prison realm, even without knowing what it was, that he'd lost, right? And so obviously this was hardly a fair fight, but even so, the one thing he had that gave him any sort of purpose or identity is gone. I think it's very intentional that it's just his face missing. And he takes a slight step back, and then behind him he sees Geto Suguru, another person he no doubt feels that he failed to save. A slight smile appears on his face, which is so sad. And as the memories flash through his mind, he's defeated in the exact same way his domain works, with an overload of information in a very short time. In an incredibly cruel, brutal way, his closest bond has been turned into a weapon against him. The prison realm ensnares him, and he accepts that he's lost. As he turns to see Geto, his body, his cursed energy, everything his almighty six eyes can tell him, say that the man in front of him is Geto, but his soul knows otherwise, which is just wild because I imagine he would have wanted nothing more than for Geto to be alive, but even after the hell he's been through just now, he still knows that can't happen. And by his reaction, this is the first time that whoever is possessing him has been caught out, as he informs Gojo of, sadly, yet another failure of his, failing to dispose of Geto's body. It seems as though every single bit of sentiment or human feeling that Gojo has ever had is being used against him. The realm shuts and Gojo is sealed. But when he's inside, he's not panicking. Instead, he's just thinking to himself, it'll be fine, I have faith in everyone. He alone may be the honored one, but that doesn't mean he's the only one. In a similar way to how Yuji accepts that he doesn't need to be the one to save Gojo, Gojo accepts that he doesn't need to be the one to save everyone else. And it feels like he has this ever so slight separation from his identity as the strongest. He still sees himself as the strongest, and obviously he is, but it doesn't feel like he's clinging on to it as desperately as he maybe once was, as though he's able to say to himself, hey, it's gonna be fine, you raised all these strong allies for a reason, let them do their thing. And again, this isn't a front or an act, you know. There's no one else in this realm with him. He's not trying to convince anyone. And this to me is the last bit of proof I needed that the claim against him later on in the series that he didn't care about the next generation just isn't true. You know, as though it wasn't clear enough from how he trained them all and watched over them the way he did. It's just that he doesn't always vocalize these things to everyone around him. He genuinely does believe in them, to the point where he doesn't even seem that worried about being trapped in here. You know, despite realizing what an awful place it is, he believes the others will still get him out, even against someone who managed to trap him. Now, obviously the fallout of him being trapped is huge. Just from Jogo still being alive, one of his oldest friends and my personal favourite character, Nanami, dies. RIP, bro. We also have things like Sukuna's massacre happening due to Yuji being knocked out, and that's not even mentioning things like Mahito or Dagon killing as many as they did. But above all, I actually found myself getting kind of angry at this panel. Gojo has been deemed an accomplice and is permanently exiled. Attempting to remove the seal will be considered a criminal act. And this really shows just how sick these Jujutsu higher-ups are. You know, without Gojo, the whole country is in danger, but rather than mobilizing to get him back, they're making it as difficult as possible to do so. Not to mention using the opportunity to get rid of Yaga and Yuji. The curses weren't the only thing Gojo was holding back this whole time. You know, the higher-ups were hiding their disgusting level of corruption. You know, the ship they're on is sinking and they're just making sure they're at the top of the shipwreck, right? And so as we enter a very different world without him, that obviously concludes Gojo's time in Season 2. So for anyone who's not up to date with the Jujutsu Kaisen manga, there will be major spoilers beyond this point. I do plan to make more videos on JJK, with the next one being Nanami, so subscribe if you want to see that. But otherwise, thank you for watching. Okay, last chance to get out if you don't want spoilers. And for everyone else who's still here, who's either read the manga or has simply been spoiled for what happens because, you know, it's pretty impossible to avoid JJK spoilers, I'm just going to jump ahead to chapter 221, you know, where they're preparing to bring him back. Like, obviously, yeah, there's mentions of him in the culling game, etc., but I really don't think there's anything worth mentioning in terms of his character that hasn't been said already. So, the group, in particular Angel, is concerned about what they'll find when they open up the prison realm. Time doesn't flow normally in there, so Gojo could have experienced a century, which even for him would probably drive him insane. Because you can imagine how, given decades or even centuries, eventually that thought of, I should have just used my domain expansion from the get-go and killed everyone in there, would have entered his head, or any other, you know, dark, maddening thought could, and Geto isn't around to steer him back onto the right path this time. But when later asked about it, he said it was just like a busy week at work. The time flew by, but you'd never want to do it again. The obvious point being here that the time isolated in the prison realm didn't feel too different to his normal day-to-day routine. And to be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if part of him was actually a little bit relieved to have a break and have the pressure off him for once. But regardless, not wanting to deal with a potentially insane Gojo in a cramped space, they instead go outside, blasting the front of the prison realm from afar, only to find that he's seemingly vanished. But 8,000 meters below the surface of the Japan Trench, which by the way is as deep as it gets, beneath layers of seals and cursed spirits, to Kenjaku's utter bewilderment, Gojo returns, and is immediately greeted by a surprise attack from Sukuna, who promised that the first person he'd kill after returning would be Gojo. Also, it's got to be pretty scary for Gojo, realizing that he's in Megumi's body now, because obviously he has no idea what's happened in his absence, right? Clearly, yeah, Megumi is in a lot of trouble, but he's also got to be wondering, you know, what's happened to Yuji, as well as what else has been going on since he was sealed. For all he knows, this whole time, Sukuna's been running around just taking out entire cities, you know? None of that seems to be weighing on him on the surface, because, as mentioned before, he's capable of being cold when he needs to be, and right now is a perfect example of that. He doesn't have the time to worry about any of that, because he knows what happened the last time he let his mind stray away from the battle at hand in his fight against Toji. It seems as though he's come out of one nightmarish ideal in the Shibuya Incident and is now right back to being a human weapon, this time pointed at Sukuna. But whilst to anyone else, this would be one of the worst things imaginable, right? Having to fight this guy. But Gojo's wanted this for a long time. Sukuna is the one person in the world who could actually match Gojo's strength and prove to him that he's not isolated on some other plane of existence on his own. And Gojo wants that. But to be honest, I think more than anything, he's just simply excited to see if he can beat the King of Curses. He spent his whole life priding himself on his strength, enjoying improving it, enjoying using it, and unlike the fight against Toji or in Shibuya, there won't be all these tricks and traps here. He just gets to straight up brawl with the strongest in history. It's a simple motivation that some see as selfish, but again, I don't think selfish is the right word here. It's not at the expense of anyone else, it's more of a two-in-one. You know, he has to fight Sukuna to stop him from running rampant, and he gets to fight Sukuna and test his strength against him. But both Gojo and Sukuna have things to do before the big fight, and so they agree on Christmas Eve, the day Geto died. As Gojo says, he will only have to remember one death anniversary this way. Kenjaku laughs at Gojo's confidence, but the strongest's answer hasn't changed since last time. If you were to fight Sukuna, would you lose? Nah, I'd win. The day comes and Gojo looks deathly serious, you know, like a soldier going to war. And we later find out about the letters he left, right? If he was 100% sure he would win, why would he have done that? You know, evidently he isn't. And I think he's genuinely quite nervous, but Itadori snaps him out of it with a high five, and a much happier Gojo walks on. And I think he really needed that bit of human connection after everything that's happened, you know. He finally finds out that those hit by his unlimited void survive just fine, and that the residuals of his cursed energy means he saved more people than previously assumed. And that he's not, you know, accidentally massacred the whole floor, which again, I'm sure was really weighing on him in the prison realm, even if we didn't see it. With the man he trusts most creating a barrier, and Utahimi's technique boosting the power, Gojo fires off a 200% power hollow purple. Sukuna just shrugs it off, which really sets the stage, as that's something utterly unthinkable for anyone else. And so begins probably my favorite fight in anything. The strongest sorcerer in history against the strongest sorcerer of today. And I'm not going to do a play-by-play of the entire fight, right? But the two are initially pretty evenly matched as they exchange blows. But more importantly, however, despite their original disdain and insults towards each other, it doesn't take too long for the two to be talking to each other as equals and joking around. I love this panel of the two almost laughing with each other. You know, they're not turned to face each other, but they're side by side, even if there is some space between them. And as crazy as it sounds, I think Gojo really appreciates it. Whilst he obviously doesn't like Sukuna, he knows that he'll be honest with him. There's this kind of unspoken mutual understanding between the two, that Sukuna is the one person that Gojo knows isn't going to treat him differently due to his title of the strongest. You know, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of people who don't, right? But I can see how, if I was in Gojo's shoes, there would always be this slight doubt in the back of my mind that, you know, everyone is just kind of being nice to him because they have to, but not Sukuna. Sukuna doesn't even see him that way. You know, he sees him as strong, yeah, but not stronger than him. And I think that's a big part of why Gojo is so happy throughout this fight. You know, it takes a while for the thought of him losing to actually enter his mind. And so right now, all his worries are just gone. And he's getting to do something he's wanted to do for a long time. In Shibuya, there was this slight disconnect from him and his title of the strongest. But now he's really putting it on the line. In fact, it'd probably be fair to say that he isn't the strongest right now. Until this fight is decided, that title is temporarily on hold. And again, just summarizing the fight, the two exchange domains and you can see the eagerness the two have to see how this will go. but Sukuna's extra range allows him to slash through Gojo, who just about saved himself with reverse technique. The two perform impossible feats that effectively put them on a different plane of existence compared to the rest of the world, opening their domains multiple times in one day, using reverse technique to regain their curse technique, which was compared to speeding up the cooling of an engine, but Gojo just looks so happy throughout. He's finally found someone he can talk to as an equal, even if the language is just fighting. There's a moment where the two are talking about, how they're gonna kill each other, and they're just grinning. There's this clear understanding that they're two birds of a feather, but of course this is still a fight to the death. And as the battle progresses on, despite Gojo getting some solid hits in against Sukuna, with Mahoraga making it even more difficult than it would be anyway, the possibility of Gojo losing enters everyone's minds, even Gojo's. But whilst everyone else is obviously bricking it, as they don't want Gojo to die, and they don't want to have to fight Sukuna afterwards, Gojo feels an intense satisfaction. The loneliness that comes with absolute strength has gone. And it's something only Kashimo seems to understand. We get an interesting look at this from his point of view when he fights Sukuna later on, talking about how he couldn't relate to anyone or love them because they were so weak in comparison to him. Obviously Gojo never says this outright, but no doubt he felt exactly the same, as though he was a different species. Until now, where it's proven to him that he's not some otherworldly species, he was just an exceptionally strong human. It's not something we can really fully understand ourselves, However, it's clear that Kashimo does, and that whatever the outcome, Gojo will be satisfied. But unfortunately, remember what I said about Amanai and Junpei only finding out they weren't alone right before they died, proving what Gojo said about death wrong? Well, sadly, now it's Gojo's turn. In chapter 235, Gojo's two black flashes have him in good shape again, and Sukuna, for the first time in a millennium, feels uneasy. Using Mahoraga's adaptation against it, he nukes Shinjuku with a hollow purple, and Sukuna looks as though he's on death's door. At the end of 235, to everyone involved, it looks as though Gojo has won. But 236, my favourite chapter in the series besides maybe 265, begins with Gojo crashing into a chair at an airport next to his old friend Geto, and his first thought is that he hopes it's a dream, so he hasn't been misinforming his students about how when you die, you'll die alone, which is pretty funny, and he's joking a bit, but again, his first reaction is there's that stuff with his dad, that Megumi still might want to know about his dad, and that he promised Megumi he'd tell him if he asked. Obviously, we're about to run into Nanumi's criticism of Gojo, that he never cared about keeping sorcery going or protecting people, he just did it for the excitement. And I just don't agree. And I've spoken about why multiple times in this video, and obviously the fact that his first thought was about Megumi is more proof of that. But what I want to talk about here is how upset Gojo looks at that. He didn't want people to see him that way. That's not what he wanted to be remembered for. And Haibara saying that everyone saw him that way, we just didn't want to say it out loud, is not something Gojo wanted to hear. And the thing is, Nanami mentions that he asked Geto about why they can't just leave it all to him. Gojo wasn't there when he asked that, which means this can't all be happening in Gojo's head. This has to be some sort of post-death meeting, but I don't think it's an afterlife as such, but it's definitely not just Gojo imagining it, as he couldn't have known Nanami said that to Geto. Anyway, the point being that this isn't what Gojo thought everyone else thought about him, it's actually what everyone else thought about him. Or at least according to Haibara it is. But whilst it clearly is a bit upsetting to him, I think what he says to Geto earlier in this chapter really sums it up. You can admire a blooming flower, but you can't ask it to understand you. He's not expecting everyone else to see him the way he wants them to. He gets it. Seeing someone act the way he does, especially in the fight against Sukuna, what Nanami and Haibara said is a reasonable assumption. It's upsetting and frustrating for him, but he can't ask them to understand him because they wouldn't. We don't, you and I, we don't fully understand the burden of being the strongest? How could we? We probably all think it must be great, the same way everyone else in the verse does, but evidently it isn't. And from the outside looking in, we can see how the person that everyone is envious of doesn't have it as perfect as it maybe seems. Anyway, going back to the start of the chapter, Gojo actually admits when Geto asks him about Sukuna's strength that he felt like Sukuna wasn't given it everything he had, that even if Sukuna didn't have the 10 shadows, he still likely wouldn't have won. And more than anything, like Geto, I was shocked to hear him actually admit that. He's essentially given up on his title of the strongest, and it seems like doing so has liberated him. Going back to that intro, it's funny how losing something which made up such a huge part of his identity actually set him free. And it's something that he still feels like Sukuna is chained by, isolated at the top by his strength. In fact, he actually feels sorry for him that he wasn't able to reach him. And regardless of whether or not Sukuna does feel that isolation, personally, I don't think he really cares, but I'll save that discussion for the Sukuna video. But just the fact that Gojo had the thought process of, I wish Sukuna was able to give it his all, and I wish I was able to save Sukuna from his loneliness, shows that he's kind of gone from fighting the curses that only he could fight to trying to save the person only he could save. And it's such a beautiful ending for him. As it says, he died with no regrets. He wished Geto was there to pat him on the back before he went into the fight, but he doesn't regret anything. He doesn't regret that others around him saw him as the self-centered, arrogant, strongest sorcerer, because why would it matter? In a very different way to Sukuna, he lived the way he wanted to, and the flowers around him not understanding that isn't going to dampen that. On the battlefield, the King of Curses stands over Gojo's lifeless body, paying his respects to Gojo. And with that, I don't think Gojo could have asked for anything more from his death. Personally, I have to completely agree with what Sukuna says. You were magnificent, Satoru Gojo. I shall never forget you for as long as I live. And with that, unless Gege decides to bring him back in the last 3 chapters, in which case I'll have to make a follow-up video. I hope he doesn't, by the way, as much as I love Gojo. But that concludes the story of Gojo. If you did make it all the way here, thank you very much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this video because, as you can imagine, it took a lot of work. Thank you to Ahmed Altea for joining on Patreon. Have a great day, and I'll hopefully see you again soon.